The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Humanity First. And we have a wonderful episode ahead of us today. We have a special guest, Melanie Jones, who is a colleague of mine at BAMSI, who is going to come on and talk about Juneteenth, because this week is the week preceding Juneteenth, a holiday a federal holiday that some people think of as a new holiday, but in fact is getting on for 100 and something years old, and has been celebrated in African American communities over the last 100 years. But we'll get a little bit of insight into that, what families do on Juneteenth and why they celebrate. But before we do that, I just want to acknowledge that this month, June, is Pride Month. And Pride Month is very important when we think about our communities as inclusive communities. Over the past few years, as with many social changes, there has been a great deal of movement towards acceptance around the issue of gender and of sexual orientation. And that can be looked upon as really good movement. You think about the advent of gay marriage in Massachusetts being the first state in the union to pursue that. You think about the generational change in the attitudes towards people's private lives. My children are in their early 30s, and this is not an issue for them. It's not something they talk about. They have friends who are gay. They have friends who are straight. They have friends who are trans. It's not a part of a conversation about right or wrong, which is pretty upsetting for me this week when I read about an incident that happened in Burlington, which is in our great state of Massachusetts, that seemed to put us back a little bit. I think in some ways this issue of transgender has taken an unusual place in our society and the political debate at the moment. The trans population is probably a fraction of a percent of the people in this country, but there are people who want to make a political issue out of what trans people's rights are. And those rights are under attack at the moment. And therefore, all of our rights are under attack, because we do believe that this country is a country for everybody, regardless of who they are. But it does bump up against individual rights here. And that's exactly what we saw in Burlington this week. We saw a group of children who refused to participate in wearing colors in celebration of Pride Month. They took it one step further and they protested against that, saying that their pronouns were the USA, ripping down bunting that had been put up in the rainbow colors, and demanding that they had respect as heterosexual individuals. This is where the culture war is happening in this country, and it is quite distressing. If we think about our trans friends, they are at more risk for suicide in this country, 10 times more than teenagers who are not trans. They're at risk from assault and murder, way more than the general population. And we need to be able to protect those people and give them the right to live an authentic life in this country. That, for me, overcomes the individual rights of people whose rights are not under threat. Cisgender people are not under threat. Their rights are not. They're not being approached by a group of people who are trying to legislate them out of existence. We really need to pay attention to the houses that are burning as opposed to those aren't. This is Pride Month, and it's another reminder that there's so much work to be done and so far to go. We'll be back in a minute.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse, and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
And welcome back, everybody, to Humanity First. And we have a very special guest in the studio today. Melanie Jones with us. Hi, Melanie. How are you?
Very well, thank
you.
And
Melanie, like me, works at BAMSI and is our compliance officer in the quality department. But we're not going to talk about that today, no. Melanie. So glad that you could join us. And as we said right at the top of the show, this week is a very special week. It's Juneteenth, actually on the 19th of June, and we're sort of in the run-up to Juneteenth. And, you know, I'm really interested about Juneteenth because it's in some ways, it's the oldest holiday America's never known about, or at least much of America have never known about. And certainly me coming from another country was really interested to discover both the roots of Juneteenth and the meaning of it, and also the importance to communities, African-American communities in America. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. Last night we were having a conversation in one of our meetings, and Gwen, and Gwen Broadway has been on this show before, and she's a wonderful guest. But she was saying that every Juneteenth on the Monday, many families, African-American families, go down to Franklin Park in Dorchester, and they have a huge party all day, and it is really a celebration. And I said, oh, wow, how long's that been going on? And she said, well, I don't know, 50 years, something like that. And that's when I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about that, because it's also known as Freedom Day, right, Melanie? And that seems kind of a big deal, and a big deal that a proportion of this society knows a lot about, but I would say the majority of society hasn't known about at all.
Exactly. And I'm very familiar with the Juneteenth that they have at Franklin Park. But I did not know it was going on for 50 years. I found out about it recently because, to your point, a lot of people are not familiar with Juneteenth, and not just the people you might think. There are lots of people of color who also don't know the history of Juneteenth. And I was one for a very long time. I knew about the party, I knew about the celebration, and I heard the term, but I didn't understand what it was.
So it's sort of filtering into the consciousness of people. And I know it was made a federal holiday. Was it last year? I think it was. Was the first year. And I couldn't help thinking myself that had something to do with some of the events that had happened really since 2020, when we look back to the murder of George Floyd, for instance, and this sort of lifting of the consciousness of America around the idea of diversity, equity, and social justice. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's certainly, like many of those other issues around equality and race, that have sort of been at the forefront of people's minds recently. But maybe we can go back a little bit and say, well, okay, we know what it is now. It's a day off to celebrate freedom. It's a day off to celebrate the end of slavery. But officially, that's right. Well, that's a story in and of itself. Yeah. Can we start there?
Yeah, I think it's incredible that it was 2 years from the time that slavery was supposedly abolished and ended in the country, and that there were whole towns of people that did not know that and were still living that lifestyle. And it was protected. It was meant to be that way, kept that way on purpose, that people were denied the freedoms that the government had said, okay, it's time.
And the government had done that on January the 1st of 1863, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then we're looking at Juneteenth being obviously June the 19th, 1865. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And, you might say, well, the communication was different in those years. But interestingly enough, some states embraced this straight away, and then other states with landowners, etc., didn't. And Galveston is the focal point, right. Of what happened.
They had a lot to lose. And I don't know all of the history of that, but I know that they had a lot to lose. And it's like, what was the benefit for them to abolish, to let their slaves go free. There wasn't a benefit. There definitely wasn't a financial gain. It would be a loss. And then having to share their communities. I think it went beyond, I think that it seems to me that it goes back to what a lot of people talk about is recognizing the humanity in people. And I think slaves were not seen as human. They were seen as chattel. They were seen as property. They were seen as things. And, you don't let go of things that work for you. You keep those things. And a lot of the landowners in that area and the business owners and the merchants were profiting well off of keeping slavery intact. And the slaves didn't know any better. There was no internet. There was no slow snail mail. Families weren't coming by to tell them, So it unfortunately delayed the freedoms that they deserved, and so much more than just the freedom, because everything that goes with freedom was also delayed.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating point, isn't it? And, in many of the books that I've read, there is this hypothesis that African Americans essentially created the framework of the capitalist society and the wealthy society that America is today. And of course, the argument is that, African Americans are in some ways more important than those folks that came from Europe, et cetera, and settled the land. And also, I think something that sticks in my mind is that, when you are fighting for social change and social justice, like people were back in those days, you can't assume that people are going to give up what is working for them, what is economically beneficial for those. And I do think that there's an awful lot of mental sort of gymnastics that goes on with people in those situations to justify, the terrorism of what slavery was at that time.
Right. I would agree with that. And I think the unfortunate thing too is, the terror remains too. I think it becomes a part of our psychology of people. Once you've gone through something, it changes how families interact with each other. And I think that it definitely has impacted how races interact with each other, and it keeps it going. Yeah. It's like we can't trust each other, and we can't work together, and all these assumptions are made about each other. And it's been unfortunate in that in this 21st century, we're still having these kinds of struggles because we should be so far away from it.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting point, isn't it? And I do think that the fact that people are becoming more aware of Juneteenth is another small factor in these building blocks of trust and acceptance. We're so far away from that, but I do love the fact that people actually have a consciousness of that, because I think it is difficult in areas of America where people, take the issue of banning books at the moment, which of course is a big issue. You would not have thought that a society like ours were arguing to ban books, because we've been through that. We've legislated that. There are groups of people who don't want to have those conversations, as we were talking about in the first section of the show about Pride Month. That there are people who would like to legislate human beings out of existence, which is an extraordinary thing in this society. But where's the hope in this? Where is the hope? Is it in education? Is it in sharing our values? Is it in celebrating the wins of everybody?
I think that's such an interesting question, because I think it's different for everyone. I think a lot of people say, oh, it's about exposure. It's about, taking down the barrier so we can come together and see our sameness. And then for other people, it's about they need a different type of education. They need to kind of understand that the psychology of it, and that it isn't just a matter of like, let's sit down and eat together, because you can work with a lot of people and live with a lot of people and not value them. So I think it's different things for different people. And that's part of, I think, the difficulty is that there's not one way to fix it or undo it or anything like that. But I do think for a lot of families, like my family, it is about sharing the stories and making sure that the young people are aware. And it's difficult. And there's a lot of, being a kid in the 21st century is pretty good. It's pretty good. There's a lot of fun things to do. And, everything seems right with the world. Like you can go where you want and have what you want. You don't understand that that wasn't always the case. But our family this weekend, we're having our family reunion, and we are going to make sure that one of the things that we do is talk about Juneteenth, and talk about not because we know for sure our family history, but we have enough stories that we know that we struggled to get to where we are, and we need to appreciate it. We need to make sure that we don't take those kinds of things for granted. And so I think that it comes with appreciating one another, with exposure, with education, and really valuing what you don't always understand by getting to understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, oh my God. I mean, that just absolutely nails it for me, because I think when I talk a lot about appreciative inquiry in my world, which is this idea of not assuming that everybody else's experiences are the same as yours, and therefore your reaction to something that happens. And I'll give you an example of that, actually. We were talking last night about cell phones and at work, and well, maybe we can give people a call, and we were actually talking about a group of new Americans from the continent of Africa who work at our organization, and one of the people said, well, people are a bit worried that their phone's going to be tapped. And there was this funny reaction. It was like, oh, come on. And I thought, well, wait a minute, apply the rules of appreciative inquiry here. And we had this conversation about O.J. Simpson a few days ago as well. What events in people's lives lead them to have an opinion about an event or something that they're witnessing? And that really is the essence of appreciative inquiry, isn't it?
Yeah,
that understanding.
absolutely.
Oh, I see. If I'd have had a number of experiences like that along the way, whether it be in this country, whether it's a new American coming from a different place in the world, that is going to frame the way in which we see the world now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Invalidate that. Even though you don't understand it, you understand that someone feels this way for a reason. It may not be what you experience, what you feel, but that person does, and it does absolutely shape them. And understanding that, or at least validating it, will start to open up different conversations that you can have with that person, so you can move to a place of understanding.
Yeah.
And we talked before about feeling safe enough to do that, and that's really something that I think comes with validity. When you can validate someone's experience or acknowledge it, and not just dismiss it, that's a first step. I think that's a first step in starting to build a place and a platform for a deeper conversation.
Yeah. I mean, where does it start, though? Because, I think there's so much progress being made, and then something will happen. You say, well.
Yeah. People have to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I think, we talked about being brave, too. And I think, sometimes that means you're going to be willing to look foolish, and also offend people, and be willing to apologize and willing to look silly. And most of us aren't comfortable in that position, and we don't want to be labeled a certain kind of person.
There is a risk to that.
It happens. The cancel culture is brand new, and it's live and thriving. And you don't want to get fired from your job, and you don't want to lose your friends and your family. I mean, this splits up communities.
Yeah.
So I think that the first thing is trying to find someone that you feel close enough to that you can start having those conversations. And what happens is it starts its own community. You meet their friends, they meet more of your friends. And I think work is actually a good place for that. Mm-hmm. We have at BAMSI such a diverse community of people. I mean, all different countries, languages. So I think, you start where you're at. If you're in school, that's where you do it. If you're lucky enough to be in a diverse community, or, get involved in your kid's school, because there's so many places and opportunities that, you can connect with people and understand a little bit more about someone who's not exactly like you.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it is about taking risks sometimes. It is about not being afraid to make a mistake, but also to be apologetic and to learn from that. Somebody said to me the other day that this may have been you, actually. I remember this conversation. It's actually not about anything related to, but having a conversation with somebody who uses foul language. And if you don't like that, you point that out to them. And you get in this rather comical situation where they keep saying it and keep saying sorry.
Yeah.
That's not, it's really like, could you learn from this so that you can
Right. It becomes the exclamation point on the end of the curse word. It's like, they say it and then they're sorry right after. But that's good because it creates that consciousness of it. Because I think a lot of times we do live these unconscious existences and we're just living our lives and it's all great. And we're just not really aware of what other people are going through, what other people may be experiencing, even if it's right in front of us. And so I think, by saying something, you bring to someone else's consciousness something different, or the way you move is different, the way you talk is different. So I just think that it's important when you can say something, just to start conversations.
Yeah, when we talk about allyship and when we talk about being, sort of involved in our communities, it really is about not waiting for somebody. Is it going to be an African-American person that brings this up? It probably should be, no. If you see something, say something, get involved in the conversation. And so that, your colleague isn't taking on sort of the entire burden of that, of whatever that micro or macroaggression might be.
Right. That's so true. And I think that that's when the cancel culture can come in too, because sometimes people think that, well, it's not your place. And so it can stop people. And I would encourage people to not be stopped by that. If your heart is in the right place, if your intention is well, people may misunderstand, but it is better to learn from the experience. I think, we go through life learning lessons all the time, and you will find support. I always feel like people find their tribe eventually. You will find the people who will support you and will help you, become your best version of yourself. And that's going to improve the community that you're in naturally. The better you are, the better your community.
What a wonderful way to finish. I mean, and as we approach Juneteenth, I think it is really incumbent upon us all to just delve into it, find out a little bit of that history, and realize what came after that, and not wait for somebody else to tell you. I mean, go and find out, because this is equally as much a part of the culture of this country as anything else that exists within it.
Absolutely.
Melanie, thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.